Monday. This is Jay Brew, co-chairman of Seafried and Brew. Continuing with our talk about our new book on strategic planning in a post-financial crisis type of world. And as we think about that, another piece that we talk about in the book is the whole aspect of NOH, net overhead. And it's interesting because I was interviewed for the ABA Banking Journal talking about ways to gain efficiency here in 2012, and I talked about the whole strategic element of net overhead. So that when I work with boards on their strategic plan is that I say to directors, you want to concentrate on net overhead and set a strategic goal around net overhead. And the question usually comes up, and it did after the ABA article came out that was asking, well, how do we figure out net overhead? Is that net overhead is the difference between your non-interest income and non-interest expense. So taking one from the other, and once again that's as a percentage of assets, is that then gives you the whole net overhead. And why do we think of it in this way? Well, the thing is that if you go back in time, is that you would go to a convention and you'd hear a banker brag about this high level of non-interest income because he was involved in all these businesses, insurance, securities, every type of non-interest income business, and he was making lots of non-interest income. But what he wasn't telling everybody is that he had a very high level of non-interest expense. So when we think about that, is that really the differential between the two shows the balance. So you might have some very profitable non-interest income businesses, even after taking out the non-interest expense. Well, the way that it's going to show itself is in the net overhead number. So when we think about net overheads, is that when you look at on a national basis, that community banks around the nation have actually seen their average net overheads go up in here. So if we went back to, say, 2007, most likely the average nationally would be 2%. And what has happened in here is that during the Great Recession is that essentially net overheads went up to approximately about a 240 on an average basis across the country. So as we've seen this go up, is it the fact that expenses have gone up? Yes, it's on the non-interest expense side of the equation, and to some degree some pullback, but not much on the non-interest income. And this is due to dealing with credit issues. You have all of those legal fees, etc., around credit issues, and that has really put pressure on this. Interestingly enough, what we've talked about in prior webcasts is that we have seen the level of non-current loans nationally moderating and then slowly coming down, and hopefully we'll see them come down a bit more this next quarter. So as we think about that, is that interestingly enough, we've also seen on a national basis net overheads moderating and heading somewhat down in here. So it really clicks along with that level of non-current loans. So one would say if we normalize the non-current loans, most likely we'll come back to that 2% level. Well, this is one area where you just don't want to be around the national average or your peer averages. This is an area that, in my belief, that all community banks should strive to have net overheads at approximately a 1.7% of assets to 1.8. This, interestingly enough, is where the overall S&B top 15th percentile banks have their net overheads. So when you look at these top banks in the country, that they not only have great net interest margins, they not only have low tax rates, they also have very low levels of that net overhead, more in the 1.65 range on average. So when we think about that, is that to be somewhere in that 1.7, 1.8 is actually a high level of performance. When we think about that, and the way that I talk to directors about this is, if the top 15th percentile can do it, why can't every community bank do it? Why can't all community banks, because they're essentially in the same business, with some exceptions, that you're looking at the thing of having the ability to control this number and be able to sit there and say, okay, being somewhere in that 1.7 to 1.8 for those banks that are in the 2% range should be an attainable strategic goal. And my feeling is that this is part of performance banking. How do you get there? From that ABA Banking Journal article, a couple of banks have called us and said, how do we get ourselves into this net overhead region? Best way to do it is to go out and talk to bankers who have achieved these levels and ask them, how do they do it? Because we know all of you bankers out there love to brag. And bankers will talk to each other in terms of industry best practices, so that you can develop an action plan as part of hitting that strategic goal, that looking out 1 to 3 years, you can get to these levels. Have a good week. This is Jay Brew, co-chairman of Seyfried and Brew.